Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Danche wash processed Ethiopia from Heart Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Heart, based out of Portland, Oregon. And surprisingly, this is only their second ever full bag review on this channel, having previously reviewed one of their Honduran coffees about a year ago now. And if you've ever wondered why Heart doesn't appear on this channel more, the reason for that is because the person we started this channel with's favorite coffee roaster was Heart, so I always felt that they were better suited to discuss this coffee roaster. That being said, Heart is a coffee roaster that I do have a very long and extensive history with, as I have been drinking their coffee for a very long time. And recently I've been going to a coffee shop that does serve Heart's coffees, and I've been impressed with the results that I've had from them. So as a result, I decided to go ahead and pick up one of their bags, and it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed out to 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Interestingly enough, I feel like this is probably the ideal coffee roaster to describe as being on that medium light side of the spectrum, as if I had to say one coffee roaster indicates what I would define as being a medium light coffee roaster, then it is probably Heart, as they do seem to continue to bridge that gap between maybe mid to late 2010s, early 2020s coffee, and the modern coffee scene that we do have now, which skews on the very light side of things. Once upon a time, Heart was considered one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in the United States, but obviously times have changed since then. And this one does remind me a fair bit of the coffees that we'd had from them. I want to say around that time frame as well, which again, I would describe as being on the more medium light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was a little bit more interesting than I was probably expecting, as it does have all of the listed notes on there, but what really stood out the most was the brightness, as it was presented in a slightly lemongrass-like sense. It felt like the coffee might possibly be over-extracted, as it offers a pretty well-defined, prominent sugary and white peach quality as it does cool down, but outside of that, it just seemed to skyrocket in terms of the brightness based off of that first impression. So kind of a mixed impression, mixed first try on it. So on day 17, we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was still very nice, but it was surprising with how much of that lemongrass quality there was once again, as it continues to feel like it's maybe a little bit over extracted based off how the coffee itself actually is. A little less floral this time around, but significantly more of the peachiness and sugary qualities within the cool down. And based off these first couple of impressions that I did have, that was kind of my assumption or thinking on this coffee, was right at the forefront. It's probably a little bit over extracted, but it is paying off on the back end, as on the back end it cools down into just a very sugar forward experience. And one of the main reasons why I was so interested in grabbing this coffee specifically is because I've said in the past that the way I learned how to taste floral qualities within coffees were through Heart's coffees, as so many of their wash processed Ethiopian coffees were extremely clean and well defined in the listed floral sense that they did have. And as a result, I learned to differentiate a lot of the qualities between rose or lavender, or in this case, lilac. So that's what I was hoping to get from this coffee, was a very floral forward experience. Day 21 through the UFO Brewer, and the coffee is possibly the best it's been to this point, as it's offering the most peach forward experience that we've had, a slightly less floral experience in comparison to some of the earlier days, but it's still prominent in that lemongrass-like sense. So it continues to also remain pretty well defined in that white peach, transitioning into that sugary finish. So again, it's pretty well layered. You can see a lot of these characteristics right at the forefront. It has that just very bright lemongrass-like feel, where it transitions into a little bit more of a floral-like quality. And then from there, it goes into that white peach characteristic. And from there, it finishes off into what they describe as being cotton candy. And I can see that, given that there's a very lingering sugariness to this one. On day 24, do the V60 with Heart's recipe, which is a 16.36:1 at 95 degrees Celsius. And the coffee does continue to remain pretty consistent with some of the earlier results being prominent yet again. There's that lemongrass-like feel with a little bit better balance, so that has seemed to just kind of dial back with a little bit of time. So I think that's a component of this coffee just settling with a little bit more time in general, because on those earlier days, I was really surprised at just how much that seemed to dominate the experience of this coffee. Otherwise, more of that white peach-like sweetness, a very slight savory cracker quality to it as well, but I was seeing this coffee generally trending in the right direction. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is pretty nice yet again today as it's offering less of the lemongrass-like characteristics with a more direct presentation of the fruit and floral qualities. The coffee in general has settled pretty well as it's becoming a pretty direct presentation of the white peach qualities and characteristics to it. I feel like I've probably had enough reviews in the past where I said I'm not the biggest fan of white peaches. I definitely do prefer the very sugary yellow peach characteristics of a coffee, but for me it was kind of interesting seeing just how well defined it was within this coffee. Granted, I went into it really hoping it would be accentuating a lot of those characteristics, but truthfully the floral qualities were what I wanted to see the most from this coffee, but having it skew in such a well-defined white peach sense was also pretty interesting. So from this point going forward, on day 30, we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's now offering significantly less of that lemongrass-like characteristic. So given just how prominent it was on the first handful of days, it's what I kept going back to in the notes, because from that point going forward, anytime I brewed this coffee and I wasn't getting that very bright in-your-face lemongrass-like quality to it, I was much happier with the way that it was turning out. It's allowed for a much better presentation of those floral qualities, as it seems to have finally settled down into more of that sugary experience, especially within the cool down itself. And it was a pretty interesting experience given that every single time I brewed this coffee and I drank it, I said, yeah, this is not as good as what I remember. And then by the time the coffee reached about room temperature and it skyrocketed in the sugariness, I was like, okay, yeah, this is much more reminiscent of what I was experiencing, the best characteristics and traits of this coffee. So right off brew in the intermediary, I was not necessarily the biggest fan of this coffee. As it cooled down, I enjoyed it significantly more. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and again, coffee has seemed to settle well over time as that lemongrass is all but dissipated, allowing for a more clean presentation of the fruit and floral qualities. And I keep going back to that note because once again, every time I brewed this coffee, I kept thinking that I was going to get that right at the forefront of it. And on day 36 through the V60, and we opted for our standard recipe. Feels like this coffee is probably just aged out over time as it's offering a bit more of a roast characteristic in the finish than it had up to this point, with a little less of those floral qualities as well. Otherwise, the coffee has been mostly consistent with the lingering sugary quality to it within the finish. Honestly, I feel like this coffee is about as direct and straightforward of a review as it gets. Pretty well layered, and the layers are pretty well separated to it. You saw a transition within this coffee that was pretty blatant and obvious throughout the entirety of it. So when we're kind of finishing up with this one being pretty consistent at the end, it does make a lot of sense. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a very clean looking tasting wheel. Let's go through it. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Definitely a very clean experience on this one. Surprisingly, I was a little disappointed in the overall cleanliness of this coffee given the experiences that I did have at that coffee shop. I'll get into that a little bit later. And then outside of that, the experiences that I've had with Heart's wash processed Ethiopian coffees in the past, as in the past, they've been so extremely well defined and so floral forward that I've actually seen the cleanliness be there at the level 5 mark for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, even a standard one. And for that reason, I did have a lot of optimism that maybe we would get there for this coffee, but it's still very clean, very direct, very straightforward. Nothing to take away from the level 4 on this one. Finished level 4. Easily my favorite part about this coffee, the sugary cotton candy-like characteristic of this one. I know that's a very detailed or precise description of what that sugar quality was to it, and for me it was probably just a little bit more of a generic sugar quality, but it was prominent and notable enough to the point where I was really happy with how abundant it was within the finish. Level 4 where we opted to put that. Sweetness level 4, very sweet, and my biggest grievance with wash processed Ethiopian coffees is that sometimes they can lack that specific sweetness, but this one came primarily in the sugary peachy sense and then also that kind of lingering sugary quality to it outside of that. So no issues with the way that that presented, pretty high in that regard. Acidity level 4, surprisingly bright coffee, and I don't know if that's a common characteristic for a lot of the Danche coffees we've had in the past. Usually when it comes to wash processed Ethiopian coffees, I find the majority of them scoring at the level 3 mark, but this one right here, as mentioned on the earlier days, was super lemongrass forward and super bright in that sense, but the more we continued to work with this coffee, the less abundant that was, but even towards the end, it was still very bright for what we usually experience for a washed Ethiopian coffee. Florality level 4, Other thing I was a little bit disappointed in, as I wanted that to reach the level 5 mark. I've had so many of Heart's Ethiopian coffees in the past that were just super rose forward, super jasmine forward, super lavender forward, in this case lilac forward. They were just extremely well defined and clear, and it again made it very easy for me to learn the differences between the way that floral qualities taste. But this one right here, the florality was definitely a more tertiary quality to this one, as the white peach was significantly more abundant, and on the earlier days that lemongrass-like characteristic was also more abundant than that. So having it be not as prominent as I was hoping was a little bit of a letdown with this coffee, but even then it was still notable enough to the point where it scored that level 4. Citrus fruit level 4. They don't have any citric qualities on here, but even with it being toned down, that lemongrass quality was so prominent that we did have to place it at that level 4 mark. And again, I don't know if that was something that just seemed to be a unexpected quality that we experienced from this coffee, but it was so notable and abundant that it wouldn't have belonged anywhere else but that level 4 mark. Stone fruit level 4. Very white peach forward, one of the most well-defined white peach characteristics that I've experienced. So for as much, I want to say, of a letdown that it was that the cleanliness and the florality weren't at a level 5, I can say that as far as white peach characteristics of a coffee go, this one was about as direct as it got. So level 4, where we opted to put that, very stone fruit forward. Caramel level 3, we'll go ahead and move on to level 3s. It definitely did have a lot of those sugary characteristics. That's entirely where the caramel comes into play in this one, as this one was a just very sugary quality in the way that it cooled off. So level 3, where we opted to put that. And then we'll discuss 2 more things real quick. Body level 3, surprisingly a lot of texture in this coffee. I was not expecting this one to have as much body as it did, but could be a result of brewing it with the V6C. I just think that maybe this coffee in general was always intended to have a little bit more body than you'd expect for a washed Ethiopian coffee. And then the last thing, the smokiness level 2. Interestingly enough, I probably would have scored that at level 1 most days that we were working with this coffee, as yeah, it's not the latest coffee out there, but outside of that, it really didn't have many, if any, noticeable roast characteristics for us. And I've said this in the past, I feel like others are a little bit more sensitive to roast within coffee. And that could be a result of the fact that we've had some extremely developed coffees recently and in the past on this channel as well, which that's usually where we like to reserve those characteristics and qualities. But it was notable enough to the point where I said it needs to be charred within this tasting wheel, and that was towards the very end of this coffee, and I think it did take away from it a little bit. Another reason why the cleanliness didn't really have potential of scoring that level 5 mark. But no, outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've kind of hinted towards it the majority of this review that I really wanted this one to be overly floral forward, overly clean, and it's not quite the experience that I did get. It was overly lemongrass and overly white peach forward throughout the entirety of it. I mentioned that I'd had such positive results with every single coffee that I've had at a local coffee shop from Heart recently, and I've actually had the other person that I've gone with echo a lot of those same sentiments, as they've been impressed by the way that the espresso from Heart has turned out as well. So I think, interestingly enough, the coffee shop is actually a little bit better at brewing these coffees than I am, which for a lot of people, that's rare these days. It's not that often that coffee shops do such a great job of brewing coffees, at least in comparison to what we've had with a lot of, our own experiences. So credit to the coffee shop for being able to do a good job. That being said, I never had this Danche from the coffee shop. I've had some of their other Ethiopian coffees. I've had some of their other Central American coffees, and they've all turned out really nice. So it's entirely possible that this Danche just wasn't exactly what I was looking for. That being said, plenty of positives to take away from this one, which does kind of lead into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do like your white peach characteristics of a coffee, and you do like those lemongrass characteristics of a coffee, and a little bit brighter of an Ethiopian coffee, then this one has all of those characteristics and traits with a nice complementary sugary sweetness to it that is pretty prominent within the finish. So there's definitely a lot of positives to be had within this coffee. Kind of the best direction I could point somebody towards in this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Heart, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not subscribed. So right here has been a review of the Danche, wash processed Ethiopia from Heart Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.